Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Roger Booton.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
In the 1960s, about 4% of all bodies were cremated, and the rest of them were buried. And you look now, and it's about 2 out of 3 are cremated. And the estimate is by 2040, it will be about 80% that are cremated. And again, these statistics are for the United States. But if you look at that, a lot of that drives it is the cost. It can, it costs about half as much roughly to bury a body than it does, it costs twice as much to bury a body as it does to cremate one. And a lot of that has to do with it. You have to buy a plot that has to be, maintained in the future. You have the casket if you're just going to burn it up. People don't put the bodies in as nice caskets. So there's ways to reduce that cost. But the easiest way to reduce the cost in America is just to cremate. And I can understand why the world would do that, but we should also ask ourselves, this is shifting in the church dramatically. And so what does it mean for the church? So we've accepted cremation.
Well, I think there's some people who will just need to be convinced that it matters at all. Why would it matter? And I think we're going to try to do that by looking at what the Bible says, because the Bible does actually spend quite a bit of time talking about how bodies are dealt with and what that means. So obviously we're going to say that cremation is a bad idea. And the point isn't that it affects your eternal state, or your availability for resurrection. That's not the point at all. You have people, there's various, church heroes who they were burned at the stake, or you have even their body was dug up later and burned. It doesn't affect whether God can resurrect them. But the choices that we make are testifying to our beliefs. And even if our stated beliefs are orthodox, but our practices are pointing to something that's wrong, doesn't mean that that's okay. We actually, we're speaking with our actions. And so the question is, what are we saying with cremation versus burial?
And I do think we need to look at some of the most basic pictures. The one picture is when you cremate a body, when you burn it up, it is a picture of hell. And you can't escape that. Hell is about bodies being burned. Now, the flames will not consume them like it does when you earthly burn the body. But when you are burning the body, you are physically doing a picture of eternal damnation as best you can. And we shouldn't be doing that for our loved ones. Now, the Bible even talks about times where it is appropriate to do that, and we should remember that. But the fact that it says it's appropriate to do it is more testimony that says how significant the picture is. And when you put the body in the ground, like it talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, that the body is like a seed that comes up and has a different form once it's resurrected. And that's because you plant the body in the ground when you bury it. These are real pictures. The one is a picture that there's the hope of resurrection, and the other is a picture of the hopelessness of eternal damnation.
There's no neutrality in actions. And so there's this part of it where when we look to say, what should we do? One of the things we should do is we should look to Scripture and say, what is right? What is good? Not just like what is acceptable. The answer is what is acceptable is what is righteous. And what is righteous, there are things that can vary circumstantially. Should you do this on this day? When should you do this? How should you do this? But there's always something that's right to do. And so I think it's very easy just to lose that concept that we should be seeking to say, what does God say we should do? How should our lives be an example of his righteousness and those pictures of righteousness that he's put in the world?
And if you compare it to something that we talked about a few episodes ago, marriage, in that previous episode, we said that in God's eyes, if you're living with someone and you've united with them physically, you are in his eyes married to them. Whether you had a wedding doesn't matter because, you're one with them. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have weddings or that you can do whatever you want in your wedding, and it doesn't matter. You can have your wedding whenever. The wedding is a public testimony, a confession of what you believe about marriage, of what you believe about God, the role of husband and wife, all these things. So it matters what you do in your wedding. And everyone assigns, or almost everyone, Christians assign some meaning to that. That you can't just do whatever and pretend like it's a wedding. But burial is actually, something that is a pretty close analogy to that. Doesn't mean that God can't resurrect you, but it does mean that it actually matters what you're saying. And like when people go back and look at, societies from the past, burial is a big thing that they look at because it's something that survives. Because typically wherever your burial practice was, it leaves a mark, and that's something they can find and say, what does that say about the society? And so what are you saying about your beliefs by how you are handling your dead?
Right.
And there is a sense that, cremation is also about it not leaving a mark, right? If you have a completely hopeless society that you think just like people come and go and there's nothing beyond that, then why not just burn up the body? And, it really is a testimony that if you go back and you look at a society, it's a testimony of hopelessness in that society. And I think we should recognize that. I think one of the reasons that you have this shift is that people don't see anything beyond themselves, right? We become a very self-centered generation. And so children, they go, well, we're going to burn our parents rather than bury them because it's cheaper. But in the end, let's redefine that. Well, I want more money for me from their money. So what I'm going to do is to get rid of the body as cheaply as I can so I have more money. It's a self-centeredness. It's not looking towards the future. It's not looking towards any hope, anything else. It's all about self-centeredness. And as we become a more and more self-centered society, it's not surprising that 80% of bodies would be burned.
And a lot of times it's the people themselves that are choosing it.
Yep.
And then what are you saying about your life and your children and your family that you have no meaning, that you were here and now you're gone and no one will ever want to remember you? It's not a great testimony to be saying, kids, forget about me.
So if you're going to start about what is revealing righteousness, the place is the law, right? Because you have all these types and shadows, but the law actually says things that are clearly stating what's righteous and not righteous. And the law actually speaks to this. In Leviticus 21:9, it says, the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the harlot, she profanes her father. She shall be burned with fire. And now when people take this and they translate this, and that means that you put them to death with fire. But actually, God actually says how everybody's supposed to be put to death. It's put to death in Deuteronomy 17:5-7. Then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has committed that wicked thing, and shall stone to death that man or woman with stones. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. You shall put away the evil from among you. It says whoever is being put to death. This is how they're to be put to death. It doesn't overrule the person that was in, the daughter of the priest that played the harlot. That it's not saying that she gets put to death a different way. It's talking about what to do with the body after she's put to death. She is to be burned. She is to be cremated. So the law says, as a judgment for a woman who is the daughter of a priest that plays the harlot, that she is to be cremated. And so it's clearly saying this is supposed to be a picture of judgment that you're supposed to see. You look at another place that it's talking about the similar thing is like in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, where you hang the body on a tree. It's not that you hang them by their neck to die. That's not the point. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For he who is hanged is accursed of God. God says after he's put to death, you hang him on the tree. You don't hang him on the tree to kill him. It's an example that you use the body to show this is judgment. This is what happens to people. People get put to death for sin. The wages of sin is death. And so you hang it on a tree so that people can see it. You burn the woman so that people can see. This is the judgment that a priest's daughter receives that plays the harlot.
And I think this is a bit of a tangent, but you have this instruction to then bury the body. And this is another thing that today we're throwing away. that now we don't think that bodies need to stay buried. That even that person that was so evil that you were supposed to execute him and hang his body up, you put it in the ground and you bury it. He's still someone made in the image of God, and you're not supposed to disrespect God's creation by keeping a skull around and making a cup out of it like pagan nations would do. But you go to museums now and they put people's bodies in there. That's something that like the Native Americans are mad about, and they should be mad about it.
Be.
You shouldn't dig up people's graves just because they're old, just because they're like your forefathers a long time ago. There's a time that you need to dig up graves for
Right.
investigation or even for learning about the past.
I mean, if you use the land for something else, you can move graves. That's not the
but
issue.
but you still show honor by putting them back in the grave. You don't put them on a museum so that millions of people can come gawk at them.
I mean, when you did read that passage on the priest's daughter, we just, like you said, we did an episode recently on symbols. I mean, the point of that was to point forward to the church, to tell the church. I mean, the church is the bride of Christ. The church is the daughter of the high priest. The church, or the bride of the high priest. I mean, there is this part of it where those who play the harlot in that situation should be considered that they're going to be cast into hell. Those who pretend to be and who play this role. And so, again, that picture was mirroring. It wasn't just for this random picture of something. It was as a warning to the church.
And we're appalled, like when you look back and like Cromwell, I think his head was on like a post of one of the city gates for like 40 years or something. And we look back and how could people do that? That's just so cruel. William Wallace, right? You quarter him, you cut him into 4 pieces and you hang him up and so that people can see the body and how cruel that is. But we need to recognize that in Deuteronomy 21, this is a man who wouldn't obey his father and mother as the passage right before that. So he committed a sin deserving of death. Now it's saying, if anyone does it, you're supposed to hold them up so that people can see it. But the point is that this was in the context of a man who dishonored his father and mother. The woman who played the harlot was dishonoring God because her father was a priest, and it brings dishonor on God's name. And so the worst punishment was not to be put on a spike like they have done that they did for hundreds of years. This used to be a very typical thing to do with, especially somebody that was a political, rival or whatever that was put to death. And God saying, well, yes, there's a place to do that for a day or overnight. But for what a woman who has dishonored God, that gets a worse punishment. The Leviticus 21:9 verse is a stronger punishment than this verse. It's important to understand that. That's what God is saying, to burn the body. And so we're burning 80% of our bodies in this country. And then we look back at like England putting people up on posts or Roman Empire doing this, and we go, that's terrible. How could they do that? No, we're the ones that have got our sensibilities all backwards.
And like I said, we do it in museums.
And we do it in museums.
And there's for
to gawk at.
Yeah.
Let's just put
and
it
so
bluntly.
you're not even teaching a lesson like don't murder people. Look at that skull. Skulls are fun to look at.
Right. Yeah, you put the skull on the post so that you go, this is what's going to happen to you if you rebel against the government. And so there was a real purpose there to constrain sin. And God talks about, it talks about in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 that you want to put the evil out from among you. That's the purpose for it. And like you said, to put it on a display at a museum, that doesn't have that purpose. That's just for people to gawk at.
And on the heels of the episode on talking about the Pope as that Antichrist in the Catholic Church, there are old popes that
they've been doing it for 1,500 years.
They basically have a transparent casket so that you can see the body in there.
Oh, and they have like what they claim to be like bones from a saint, and like they're spread all over the place. The relics, a lot of the relics are bones. And now they're not bones from the real saint, which means that they also desecrated bodies to have their lies about that this bone is from a bone from a saint. I mean, this is just a dishonoring, and the point is it's dishonoring the idea that there will be a resurrection. Because why are you stealing bones? It's because your hope isn't in the resurrection. Your hope is in those bones.
And when you look at Scripture, it's not just this, negative association in the law where saying this is a condemnation of the person. But you see a positive example too of how people treated bodies properly. And one of those is when Abraham buried Sarah in Genesis 23. And this is when he's negotiating with the Canaanites, and the Canaanites start off in this passage talking. Hear us, my Lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. And he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron the son of Zophar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price as property for a burial place among you. And so God had told Abraham to be a sojourner in the land of promise, that he was not going to inherit it in his lifetime. It was his descendants who would inherit it. And yet, when his wife dies, he goes and he buys a little piece of that promised land so that he can bury his wife there. And he didn't say, well, I'm a sojourner, I should just cremate. He takes it seriously.
And scatter it on the path as I go.
Right, and become one with the land. But no, he's saying, I'm going to bury.
In Hebrews is really clear. Abraham didn't mistake the promised land for the end. He was looking to the heavenly city. So even at that point, Abraham recognized that the earth, in one sense, didn't matter.
Right.
And yet it was still worth even being a sojourner in the land to bury in the land.
And this ends up being, this is the only property that Abraham ever owns that we know of in Scripture.
Right.
It was a burial place, which then turned out to be essentially the burial place for the patriarchs.
Yeah, and it's the sign, it's the symbol that they're coming back there. They have a foothold in the land, and they do come back there.
And it's really important to recognize that historically, what pagan religions do is they burn their dead. This is very typical. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll burn their widow too, and who's still alive, and that they throw them on the funeral pyre. Those are not unusual things. I mean, these things have gone on for a long time. And then you look at Egypt, and Egypt is it's also, right? I mean, it's demon worship. But think about it. If you have a materialistic society like Baal worshipers that are worshiping men, they're not looking for anything beyond this world. So when somebody dies, they burn the body. And then you look at the Egyptians who are saying there is something beyond this world. And what do? They preserve the body. And so even in these pagan religions, the people who say, no, there's something beyond this, they preserve the body. And so it really is a sign of hopelessness, and it's a sign that America is going back to paganism, that we don't have enough hope to say we should keep our bodies.
And I think you look at the early church and you see something really interesting, because Rome, their standard practice was you burn the body. You might have heard of the catacombs, which, according to some stories, is where the Roman Christians hid out to escape from Roman persecution. And actually, there's no evidence that Christians hid to escape persecution. But the catacombs were a Christian site because the Christians said, we shouldn't be burning bodies. We should be burying bodies. So they went just outside the limits of the city, and they bought, pieces of property, and they dug these tunnels to bury the bodies. And they end up becoming, they buried martyrs there. And end up becoming, as you go towards Catholicism, they end up kind of praying to saints there, and so it goes a bit off the rails. But you look at that early picture of them being separate from the society around them, where everyone was burning bodies, but they say, no, we're going to go to the trouble of carving into stone, because it's not dirt. They're carving stone. Hard work with hand tools. And they're saying it matters so much, the testimony of the resurrection, that we're going to do this.
And you look and you go into those catacombs. And as you look through those catacombs, there's a lot of Christian symbolism in there. And there's a reason for that. It's because those are the Christians that were being buried there. What they want to do now is when you go, they go, oh, yes, it's because they were hiding out there, or they were doing their worship there, or all these other things. Instead of going, no, the reason you have so many is because they actually believe that you should preserve the body. Or not preserve it, but that you should bury it.
And I think even when you look culturally, and like when you look at even the financial cost of burials today, one of the reasons for the price being so high, there's a couple reasons. I mean, one is the attacks on the family, and so there's this kind of idea of families used to have, it was very common to have graves in your backyard. that you would bury your family there. I mean, what I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out is that there is no requirement for you to send a body to the funeral home. There is no, I mean, you can actually take possession of the body. You can actually bury the body. There are specific things that have to be followed, but it's not super complex. And so you can actually reduce costs a great deal if you're actually wanting to do that. But as a culture, we don't want to deal with death.
Right.
And so there's a part of it where we really want to distance ourselves from death. And so we kind of have institutionalized these things. So part of even the reflection of the cost of it is tied to our own rejection of dealing with the things that God forces us to deal with.
Yeah, because people now want to, because it used to be when your family member dies, you set them in your front parlor, people come, visit you, awake depending on, which culture you're coming from, and then you bury the body the next day. And there's no funeral home. You're doing everything. You're dressing them, preparing them. And I mean, now we want to send them off to the funeral home. We come, and they painted them up with makeup. Sometimes people even there's people that have got like catastrophic injuries, like head injuries, and they will reconstruct their head. And then you go look at them, see, oh, look, they are supposed to look like they're still alive, but they don't, because when you die, your body immediately begins to break down. Even in a freezer, death is real, and we want to pretend like we can pay money to the funeral home. They'll solve our problems for us. We can go see the person. They look like they're alive, but we know that's not the person because they don't really look like it. And then they deal with everything. And I mean, that's, in a sense, it's easier, but you're washing your hands of the reality that death is bad.
Well, it's this picture of, is death the end or is there hope? If there's hope, then you don't have that much problem washing the body. You don't have that much problem dealing with it. If you go, there is no hope, and when I die, I'm gone, then death is a scary thing that you have to get rid of as fast as you can, whether it's by putting out a pile of sticks and throwing the body on top of it like pagan religions have done, or handing it off to a funeral home. We have to recognize this is a testimony of our society's view of hope, and our view of eternal life, and our view of something beyond this life. That when you say there is no hope beyond this life, you burn your bodies. This is it just makes sense.
Yeah, and burials are more expensive, and it depends a lot on the area, because local areas have different regulations. But it can also be very cheap to do a burial as well. If there's property, if you make a casket or buy a cheap casket, it can be very affordable too. So
it can be cheaper than a cremation if you're not worried about the show.
Yeah.
Because so often what people want to do is they want to have a really expensive casket because they want to, and sometimes it's good desire to go, oh, look, I'm honoring my relative. But then they go, oh, it's so expensive to do a funeral. Well, a lot of the expense of the funeral is because of pride. A pine box works fine, and that's not that expensive. It's not expensive to make, or you can buy them pretty cheap from Walmart. But people want to drive up the cost of a burial where it doesn't need to be driven up. They just want to drive it up out of often, and sometimes it's legitimate honor to someone whose honors due. But if you don't have the money, why honor them? And the choice should be to reduce the cost, not burn up the body instead.
Yeah, honor them by burying them.
Right. That is the primary honor that you're giving to somebody, is by burying them.
Yeah, and I mean, and sometimes too, the funeral home can be pretty predatory, because you have a grieving family who just wants to respect and honor their loved one, and so they get upcharged all over the place. And I don't know, I'm not saying every funeral home does that, but I think it is a big problem.
Which means you have to think about it now. If you're sitting here going, okay, I want to do this, and we don't have the money to do these things, the way you change culture is you start being deliberate. Is you go, okay, what would it take to do this? What do I need to do? And you start thinking through some of those issues, and you actually make plans to deal with it in a different way, because it takes work to change tradition. You can't, the easiest thing to do is to ride on the rails that have been laid down for you. And the rails are going to be, you're going to do an expensive thing, and everything's going to have a charge on it.
And I think you go back to 1960s where you had less than 4%. Like 3.57% or something like that, bodies that were cremated. you look at that, and we were just running on the rails. Because this is the Christian view. This has always been the Christian view. This isn't like it probably sounds very radical to people listening to this episode, unless you go back to the 1960s, and that's not radical at all. Everybody understands this. Obviously, this is what a Christian culture, a culture who professes to have some understanding beyond the materialism of Darwinism. Any society that has that, they're not going to cremate their dead. So what we're saying is like something that was so widely accepted that nobody thought about it. And then all of a sudden people go, but we can save you money. And now all of a sudden this has changed and nobody's going, whoa, wait a second. How come it's all of a sudden now it's fine to desecrate bodies? Because it is a form of desecration of bodies.
And they were thinking about it more than just the burial, because they would bury people intentionally with, I guess, with their feet pointing towards the east, so that when Christ comes, you stand right up. And they would get often buried in a churchyard. You're with the company of saints. You're all rising up to be resurrected. And I'm not saying you have to do that. I don't know if it's bad. I'm not saying it's bad to do that or you have to do that. But they were actually thinking about it and taking it seriously and saying, we're going to testify that we're ready. And
they're doing it deliberately to say that to everybody walking to church every day, that they go to church to say, you're going to be in the grave. It says in Ecclesiastes 7, it's better to go into the house of mourning than the house of feasting, because you remember what your latter end will be. And so they build all the graveyards that are around churches so that people would walk through there. And, the old ones, they would actually bury people inside the church itself. So as you walk down, that you were constantly reminded, you're going where people were and they're now dead, and you will be there too. And so, again, it's all about whether you have a view of something beyond yourself, beyond your lifetime or not. And so they were trying to deliberately say that there is something. And this is what all the Old Testament saints understood this. Like you look at Exodus 13, 19 through 21. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. When they carry Joseph's bones from Egypt into the promised land, that is a picture of the resurrection. And Joseph's not going, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever. He's going, you have to swear to me in 160 years or whatever it is between there and where Moses takes up the bones. You have to swear to me that you'll take up all of Israel, not just, right, but all of Israel has to swear that they will take my bones with them. This is how important he saw the picture. And like you said, that, earlier churches understood this. They understood how you bury and all these other things, because they're saying the pictures really, really, really matter. And that's clearly the testimony of Scripture, because Joseph's saying, you have to take my bones with you, because this is the resurrection. This is me going into the promised land. And that's, Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith. That's what is referenced with Joseph, that he made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instruction concerning his bones. How do you know that Joseph had faith? It's not, that he had visions from God. It's that he said, my bones matter. Take me back to Israel. Because he had a hope for a better country, a heavenly country. And so he saw that, and that was his testimony of hope. And when we burn a body, we go, there is no hope. That's why you burn the daughter of a priest that's a harlot.
And, the idea that we, like you were saying, people would probably think this is a radical topic, but in the 1960s, it would have been just normal. And you think of some of the other things, just 65 years ago. In the 60s, most places were closed on Sundays. Right. We actually honored at least, through the law, honored the Sabbath, and places were not allowed to be open. And now it's very unusual if something is closed on Sunday. And the same thing, if you talk to a lot of professing Christians about the Sabbath, they'll kind of look at you sideways and what do you mean?
And God says that there has to be a Sabbath so that you can testify that there's still a rest remains for the people of God, that there's still hope of salvation. that Paul wrote about in the Psalms when he says that I will not let you enter my rest. That God said this because there was still a rest to come, and when we don't keep the Sabbath, so it very much ties to the idea of burying the body. Is that if you have hope, if you have the idea that there will be an eternal rest, you put the body in the grave. If you don't think there'll be an eternal rest, you might as well burn it with fire. And so we talked before about Abraham buying the land from the sons of Heth. And it wasn't just for Sarah. I mean, he gets buried there, but it says in Genesis 49:29 through 32, then he charged them, he being Jacob, then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And so Jacob is going, and notice the line here. The line is basically the line of Christ, right? These are the people that the Messiah is coming from, which is why I don't think Joseph was buried here. And so you have the people, and Jacob's going, I'm in that line. When you carry me into the promised land, just don't dump my bones anywhere. I need to be put into that cave. And they go up and they bury him in that cave. Because that was, again, Jacob is looking at it and saying, this is the testimony of having hope. This is the testimony of having hope of eternal life.
We shouldn't separate this even from property rights.
Right.
Because there's this part of it where Abraham bought this land hundreds of years, several hundred years before. And
430 years before.
Right. And so you see,
I guess at that point, like 250.
Right. And so you see that there's this expectation that the people of that place will recognize that that land is still owned, because there is this, if you're all going, we want to have a place to bury our dead. We want that. We believe in this hope. We believe in these things. I mean, there's a part of it where it starts to seep its way into your culture and how you think about things. It changes things, and it gives a permanence to them. And so you can even see it where God uses it to sanctify a culture or to give stability to a culture. And when you abandon these ideas, when there's nothing, then who cares? I mean, they look at you and they go, you say you own this land, but if I kill you, if I take, what does it matter? We'll burn your body, and then the land belongs to us. And there's just a real difference in how you think about things.
And it really is interesting, because if you look now, that our laws really haven't caught up with our practices, the hopelessness of our practices where we just burn bodies. Because the laws about if you have a cemetery on your land where somebody buried their family, I mean, there's all kinds of laws related to that about what you have to do to move the body and who you have to get permission from. And I mean, it's very complicated, because we're basically going, no, that's a real claim that still exists on that land.
Right.
That's a real claim. And so you can't just dig up the body and move it. You have to go through a lot of process to do that.
Unless, of course, it's a Confederate general who is buried, and there's laws that you can't move graves willy-nilly, and then he falls out of favor, so they tear down his grave. Because that happened a few times. Yeah, you just ignore the law.
Right. So I'm not saying that we follow the law, but still embedded in our laws, we can see that people saw the importance of burial, and that they didn't just go, this is a light thing, because they went even 100 years later, you have to consider moving those bones. And you can't just go, oh yeah, somebody buried people there before, we're just going to plow this up and build a mall here or whatever. You're not allowed to do that. And when you buy property, that's a big deal when you buy large acreage, because where are there actually bodies buried? Because you have to figure that out with what you can do with the land.
Yeah, like there's they put in some shopping center near here, and like out front there's like a little cemetery. They didn't just bulldoze it. And I think I don't know if this is true, but I think in Israel, they're very, you cannot move a grave. So, sometimes they have, done highway overpasses over graveyards. So, I mean, you could go too extreme where you can never move a grave. But to say you can't, you should need to be thoughtful about it and not do it for no reason makes sense.
Right. And or somebody want to read this?
And this is, what's the Matthew one? Is it just the reference to the
It's that it really mattered where they buried the body because that was where Christ had to come from. So it's Rachel weeping for her children.
Okay. And like you were saying, that with the cave of Machpelah, it was the line of Christ was being put there in that grave. You actually see other significance relating to Christ and where Christ comes from with the death of Rachel. And so in Genesis 35:18-20, and so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. And so this death of Rachel, which kind of just seems like something that they mention in passing here, but as you can already see, Bethlehem, that this is going to be related in significance to where Christ is born and where Christ comes from, and that's referenced as well in Matthew 2:16-18. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem, and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And so you can see where something that, like I said, seems like this, something that was just mentioned in passing, ends up being this significant thing that's part of prophecy that points to Christ, that points to the actions surrounding his birth and the significance of things. Again, we're not going to go into depth here, but the podcast that we did recently about the Old Testament, how those things were symbols and how those things were pictures, this is just another example of, and in this case, where God's using death, or her death being marked and her grave being marked, tying back to, significance to prophecy related to Christ.
And just the fact that they put up that marker that was still there to that day. And this is 450 years later or something like that. And that marker was still there and it still matters. And so when Jeremiah writes about it, he knows about it. He knows about the grave. And then when Christ comes, and it's this connection that people can still go and say, this is where she was buried, and not this is where she was burned, and then we scattered the ashes everywhere.
And here you with the setting up the grave marker, I mean, you have a precedent for graveyards for having actual memorials, that you're not just burying people and then forgetting all about it. And graveyards can be powerful things to say how were people remembered. Now, well, some places are more cookie cutter. Some places people are taking time and saying, what phrase do I want to put on my gravestone to testify for people walking by, to say, what do I want them to remember about my life or about God? And it's something that, cremation, you have this new age. Now you're back one with the earth again, or you're present where your favorite place. It's not the same testimony to your descendants, to future generations, where you can make a real statement.
I used to, when my children and I would go for walks, a lot of times when we would go by churches, we would go back and walk in the graveyard. And
you'd go, you better behave.
I mean, and part of the reason was to just remind them from early ages that death is a real thing. It's a thing that's very far from children's mind. But you would go and you would look, and there were stories in this. I mean, not just what was on the stone, but you would see fathers and mothers, and you would see children who died untimely deaths. Right. You would see where there were wars, and there were people who went off to war, and they died in the war. And you would see sometimes people making reference to other people that they loved so-and-so, and they were never able to be. I mean, there were stories in all of these things, because in the end, people were going, it's honor your father and your mother. It's like you were saying, these are commandments that God has given, and even the unsaved, they're all supposed to obey them. And you can see even when they do it idolatrously or different ways, that they still are a picture of what God is trying to make out, is that he created these lives, he created them, and they're all going to rise one day. Some to eternal torment, and some to, to serve us with Christ for eternity and to eternal rest. But that's all there when you look for it and you actually recognize that, what you're looking for.
And the fact that all these people were buried, it's not turning around and saying that man gets to judge, right? It's not that you go, well, this person's wicked, so you burn that body, because as it says in Deuteronomy 21, right, even the wicked person that had to be put to death to put out the evil from among you, even that wicked person, they were still supposed to be buried. So it's not our responsibility to judge, except in the very limited cases that we're to judge, but everybody's supposed to be buried with the picture that everybody will be resurrected, the wicked and the just. They'll all be resurrected.
I mean, yeah, you were mentioning graveyards. I mean, a couple years ago, I went to London and went to Bunhill Fields, which is where it was like a potter's field where people who didn't have a home church, Anglican parish church, were buried. So all the nonconformists had to be buried there, or the Congregationalists had to be buried there. Okay. So, I mean, people talk about that, that's going to be the best place to be on Resurrection Day because of all the theologians, hymn writers, all these people being resurrected from there. But you go there now, and it's like completely being taken over by weeds. It's, there's no honor showed to the people who were buried there in the past. And you go big condemnation on the Church of Scotland is you go to the cathedral in Scotland where John Knox is buried, and he was buried right out front of the church where he preached, and they've paved it over. It's a parking lot. They have a little plaque that doesn't even have his name on it, and that's showing how much they care about his memory and the things that he stood for, because they're apostate, and it's shown by how they treated the people who went before them, pave over them.
Yeah, and that idea of having markers and memories when you're talking about graveyards is, the family plots, I think, are significant too to what was important to people. And you see a husband and a wife, or a child that may have died when they were younger, all there together, and you get that picture of God's idea of a family, a husband and wife. And
a lot of them used to be a crypt that would go down, and they'd put the body in there, and then by the time the next person in the family died, you expected the flesh to be, rotted away, and so you'd gather up the bones, you'd put them in a smaller place in the same crypt, and then you'd put the next body on the shelf until it decayed. And that it was this idea of both hope and also continuity of the family, and it had all these pictures there that are important pictures. That is like the Cave of Machpelah.
It doesn't mean that every grave has to be honored forever. It doesn't mean that every marker has to be kept in absolute perpetuity, and there can be times, like you say, where you end up kind of consolidating graves or moving bones or moving things like that. And so there's just part of it when you insist that everybody has to have their own mausoleum or their own this huge edifice, that does really push the cost up. But when you're willing to, one of the reasons why Rachel's marker was left was because Jacob was, because Jacob was important, and the nation viewed him as a father. Everybody's grave marker wasn't always left in the place of prominence and wasn't always preserved for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that doesn't have to be the case every time as well. It's one of those things where there's a point where you do consolidations and you do things like that.
That said, if it's your grandfather, they're going to take his gravestone down. You should go complain.
Or you should do the consolidation. Or you should do something to show honor. But you can take things too far, and you can make it ancestor worship. It's not like you can't fall into sin on these very same paths.
And we talked about Jacob, knowing where he was buried, right? And Abraham and Rachel. But on the other hand, it makes a point with the judges. Most of the judges, maybe not most, but certainly a lot of the judges, it says they died and were buried. Not that they died. And
right.
The Bible makes it very explicit that they were put in the ground, that they weren't burned. Jephthah would be an example in Judges 12:7. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried among the cities of Gilead. And so this is like judge after judge. I was surprised when I was, researching verses today for this episode, is how many times it said in Judges that this judge died and he was buried. It wasn't just that he died and that he had ruled for 17 years, which is a very common thing, but they talk about burying the body over and over and over again, they being God.
and not the body,
right.
The bodies.
Right. And it's each one of these, and just God spending so many words talking about it, because the Bible is the most printed book in the world by far. And God said from time past, knowing it would be the most printed book, that I want those words printed over and over and over again. And that's one of the most important things to know about Jephthah. And I'm not saying that it's a huge amount, but it was, it was half a sentence. Well, a half a sentence when it's printed 10 billion times is a bunch of printing.
Right.
Which an interesting parallel when, in the records of 16th century England, you don't know when people were born and you don't know when they died. You know when they were baptized and when they were buried, because that's the date that they wrote down. Now, baptism, that's a whole separate issue. But they said that this is the important day, the day you're buried.
To the point where when David and Bathsheba's baby dies, David makes mention of being able to, they'll both go to the grave at a certain point. You know what I mean? And a lot of times that verse is mistaken to be that there's a guarantee of seeing him in heaven. But the phrase was much more along the lines of, when I go to the grave, we'll be, there will be a reunite. We'll be together.
Well, it doesn't even say together. It says, I am going where you were.
Where he will be.
I will join where he is.
Right.
Which I don't think is even talking about them being together. It's just they're both in the grave.
But I mean, that's what I mean is just there's this, that was so accepted that was what was going to be done. That the language even was just, and it's even something that we've moved away from the way we think about it, that we don't think that that's a foregone conclusion.
And even throughout it's throughout, 1st and 2nd Kings, the picture over and over again is that are you joined with the faithful or are you joined with the faithless? Because they would bury kings in different places. Like in 1 Kings 11:43, then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. He was buried with the kings, right? And then you have somebody like Ammon in 2 Kings 21 through 26. So he walked in all the ways that his father had walked, and he served the idols that his father had served and worshipped them. He forsook the Lord God of his fathers and did not walk in the way of the Lord. Then the servants of Ammon conspired against him and killed the king in his own house. But the people of the land executed all those who had conspired against King Ammon. Then the people of the land made his son Josiah king in his place. Now the rest of the acts of Ammon which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And he was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah. Then Josiah his son reigned in his place. So there were kings that were buried in the valley of the kings. There were kings that were buried where David was buried. And there were kings that weren't because they were evil. And so they would be burying bodies going, there will be a resurrection, and there'll be a resurrection of the just and the unjust. And so they'll be separate and they'll be divided. And so they're dividing the bodies with this picture because it really is a picture of the resurrection. It's a picture of the hope of the resurrection.
It doesn't mean cultures always get it right, but in Scripture there were times where God was using them to draw lines and distinctions. There are plenty
and the fact that he recorded it over and over and over and over again, it means it's important. When he doesn't say this body was cremated, it means it's important that it was buried, because he could have just been silent, but he wasn't. He specifically tells us what happened to the bodies.
And we can even see that in culture. I mean, you see of certain, Memorial Day and things like that. You think of some of the graveyards that are, Arlington or in Normandy, where and the care that they take in those and to keep them pristine.
Right. Memorial Day used to be called Decoration Day, because they'd go and decorate. I mean, they'd clean up the grave sites and they'd remember the people that were lost in the Civil War.
I mean, one of the things I think that's just important to call out is when you look at practices that we should do, some people will just look at Scripture and they'll see a description of something and they'll go, well, if it describes it, we should do it. And description is not prescription. And one of the reasons why we started with the law was because the law actually talks about, like I said, burying even those who had been killed for wickedness. So the law talks about specific things, and then as we go through, the description is even specific at times as to what those distinctions are. So we're trying to follow a particular pattern of how do you look for Scripture, both with prescription and description, to say what should be done.
Right, because you can always interpret narrative, and the law gives you it's very direct. This is a curse. To burn somebody's body is a curse.
Right.
And so you look at those narrative and see how important God is putting on it and how important it is to record it. But the law gives you definitive statement that it's a curse. That's why you burn the daughter of a priest that played the harlot.
And as you're talking about cursing, I mean, there are more verses that talk about that the cremation being a sign of cursing. In Amos 2, 1-2. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. But I will send a fire upon Moab, and it shall devour the palaces of Kerioth. Moab shall die with tumult, with shouting and trumpet sound. So here you've got where because of a burning of the bones of the king of Edom, God's going to send now, and he said, I'm going to burn Moab. I'm going to send a fire upon them. And so God is showing that both that he judges people, and he's even showing the justice of it. You burned his bones, I'm going to burn you.
And think about how serious that is. He burned the bones of the king of Moab, the king of Edom. So God's going to judge them. And we think, oh, it's fine for us to burn our father's bones. It's fine for us to burn our mother's bones. And no, it's not. God says he judged them for doing this, judged them for showing such disrespect. And it's important as we think about this too, because, and this will sound kind of weird, but one thing we need to recognize is when it says that they burned their bones to lime, that concrete is one of the oldest building substances around, and you need lime to build with concrete. And people have known how to burn bones down to lime for a long time because that's required for concrete. And so this idea that they didn't know how to cremate, that's newer. No, they knew how to cremate. If you build concrete, and I'm not saying you can't do cow bones, because you can, right? You can make lime from bones, not human bones. But they knew how to make lime from bones for as long as we know.
It's what a bonfire was. It was a bone fire.
Right.
It's just, it's like that word that we don't think about being for bones, but that's how old it is.
And the whole point is that you burn them until they're cremated, until they're fine, right? That they are powderable.
Because fire is a reducing thing, right?
So, somewhat related story. I was reading a news story or seeing a news story about, this was a few years ago, where a guy who ran a crematorium got in trouble because he was not handling the bodies properly. He was just throwing them behind his house. He was sending out people dirt instead of ashes. So not a great guy. But they were interviewing the president of the Crematorium Association of Georgia, I think it was. And he was like, yeah, this guy, he was not doing the right thing. He was burning the bodies and putting the bones in a wood chipper. That's not what we do. You do have to grind up the bones. But he was putting them in a wood chipper. And it's so you're telling me that the problem is he was putting them in a wood chipper that you might buy at Lowe's. You were putting them in a different type of chipper that chips them to a slightly different consistency, but that's okay. So he was disrespecting the bodies, and you're honoring the bodies. You're both disrespecting the bodies. And what the guy was doing was bad and sleazy and dishonest. But the whole industry had a problem with respecting the bodies.
And then, of course, there's the story about the prophet who went into the king of Israel, and as he's coming out, another prophet gets him to eat with him, and then he gets killed by a lion, and they're buried together. And there's the prophecy that prophet makes, that those bones will be burned on the altar, and that's fulfilled in the times of Josiah in 2 Kings 23, 15 through 20. Moreover, the altar that was at Bethel, and the high places where Jeroboam the son of Nebat made Israel to sin and made, both that altar and the high place he broke down. He burned the high place and crushed it to powder, and burned the wooden image. As Josiah turned, he saw the tombs that were there on the mountain. And he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar, and defiled it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. Then he said, what gravestone is this that I see? So the men of the city told him, it is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things which you have done against the altar of Bethel. And he said, let him alone, let no one move his bones. Say, let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. Now Josiah also took away all the shrines of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made to provoke the Lord to anger, and he did to them according to all the deeds that he had done in Bethel. He executed all the priests of the high places who were there on the altars and burned men's bones on them, and he returned to Jerusalem. The burning of bones God said, this is judgment. This is cursing. That Josiah went and burned those bones. He dug up the bodies. They didn't dishonor the bodies. They buried the bodies. But Josiah was commanded to go and dig them up and burn them by God as a sign of cursing. We should not be cursing our relatives. It is not the right thing to do because God says it is cursing.
You know, as we've been talking about pictures and just seeing that, I think of the burnt offering. And obviously that wasn't a person, that was a sacrifice. Right. But every day that burnt offering would burn there as a picture of hell.
Always have to be burning, yes.
It also makes you think of Christ and where it talks about that God did not want his Holy One to see corruption. And while we can't stop our relatives from seeing corruption, like Joshua was saying, we should not be the ones causing corruption to them, like throwing them in a wood chipper and things like that. And so, I mean, you see these...
We're not supposed to put signs of cursing upon them.
Right.
And it's interesting. I was listening to a book on the Nuremberg trials and where they're, killing the Nazis or executing some of the leading Nazis. And they were very careful to immediately execute them and then immediately cremate them and scatter their ashes so there'd be no memorial to them, because they knew this is a way to dishonor them, to make sure no one's ever going to go to their grave and remember them and honor them. So why are you going to do that to your relative?
And that may have been a very appropriate...
Right.
That
some people are worthy of dishonor.
Well, and the point is that they weren't like Christians today. They were actually thinking about these things and saying these things matter, and we can debate whether their decision was right or not, but what we can't debate is they were actually thinking about it and said these things matter. And now so-called Christians and some real Christians, they look at these things and they say they don't matter. How do we shift so quickly to the point where we don't realize that these basic things, they really matter? These pictures really matter. So many things in the world are just pictures so that we can understand other realities. Bread is a picture of the bread of life. And cremation is a picture of burning in hell.
You also can't deny that their actions had the desired effect. You know what I mean? That
right.
That doing this,
people understood it. Yes.
And it prevented the things that they that they wanted it to prevent.
And they had a real purpose for it.
Right.
Right. And like with Moses, you have an angel taking his body so that they don't worship the body. But in this case, that's what they were trying to do. Make sure nobody will worship the body. We'll make it so nobody can find the body.
Another place where you see a passage related to the burning of bones is in 1 Samuel 31, 10 through 13, speaking about Saul's body. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the walls of Bethshan. And they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And so here, they, you see that they're wanting to prevent the Philistines from treating Saul's body in this way. And yet at the same time, they bring them in I don't know if it was, I'm not sure if the exact reasons of it, but they ended up burning them. They didn't burn them hot enough to destroy the bones. They burned them just to destroy the flesh. And then they took and buried the bones. And so, it's, I don't know whether it was things had been done to their body, so they thought it was better to burn their flesh. But again, you can see that there's thought involved. We want to show honor. They're looking at them. They're trying to decide how to do that. They're definitely not going to, they didn't burn them to destroy everything. And so you can see all the elements at play of both God causing some level of dishonor to Saul, and at the same time, there are people who are trying to honor Saul.
Right. And I think that's one thing that you see is that I think the chances are, when people put them up on the wall, first of all, it rots, and it also does, it's intended to be grotesque, so they typically tend to mutilate the body so that people see it as grotesque. So they're trying to show kindness to him. They're trying to honor Saul. But at the same time, God is going, Saul had a demonic spirit. God is still saying he has the picture of hell on him, even though the men that were doing it weren't trying to give the picture of hell. I don't think you can separate the fact that even though these men are trying, and it says in 2 Samuel 2, 4-6, then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. And David's looking, and he's going, you were trying to bless. And there can be definitely times where that could be a blessing. And like you said, they were being deliberate, but God at the same time is being deliberate too. And he's having them burn the body where they're doing it out of kindness. They're doing it out of honor. David sees them doing it out of honor and says, this is good, what you did. But at the same time, the body was still burned, and Saul was rejected as king.
I think one of the things that just kind of as we take away from this is, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, how do you change your culture? How do you change this? I mean, you can do it at a family level. At a church level, you can also think about it where churches should be aware of the cost of burials. They should be aware of the pressures on people. And there are times there should be teaching on how do you navigate this? What's the right level of honor to show? How can the church work with the people in the church to reduce the cost of a burial so you can have a God-honoring burial, so that you can honor them without making it about pride, without making it about a show, so that God is honored, so that the way that God desires us to show honor is carried out. And it takes thought and it takes care, but it's worth doing that. It's worth being deliberate.
And we've created something that, I mean, most churches used to have graveyards, right? I mean, cemeteries, there were always cemeteries. I don't mean to say that, but it was usually because the graveyard right around the church was full, and that they would do cemeteries someplace else, or the cemeteries would be for the people that weren't faithful. And we need to recognize that people were thinking about this and being deliberate about this, and they deliberately wanted the testimony of those bodies there so that people remembered. The worship of God is about life and death. It's about eternal things. It's not about these temporal things that right now you go, oh, I don't have time to go to church. And then you walk at the body and you go, well, these people thought they didn't have time either. And now, guess what? Everybody runs out of time. And so the question is, what are you doing with that time? And are you preparing for eternal life or not? And I think too often churches don't want to deal with graveyards and stuff. And that's probably a mistake. I mean, churches should be saying it's important how you deal with bodies and teaching on it. I mean, there's so many examples in scriptures that talk about burial. Why are we ignoring it? Why are we pretending like God had nothing to say about this? Because I think most churches just go, yeah, whatever you want to do, that's fine. And they don't actually sit back and say, no, God actually talks a lot about this.
But if you put graves around your church, how can you then in a few years become a mega church?
Exactly. That's even a better reason to put graves around your church. And it tends to give continuity to churches. The churches, I mean, you look at some of these old churches, like we attended a church that, is 160, 170 years old now, and they had a graveyard. And that gives not necessarily good continuity because the church can apostatize and stuff. But it also says the church is planning to be there for a while.
But because you can often have a problem where there's people who are members of the church only because they want to be buried with their family, and they hate the doctrine because they're apostate. They're probably not even Christians, but they have a high incentive to not leave. But every good practice also has challenges that come along with it.
Right.
We were going to do an episode tonight where we were going to record on cremation and on church discipline. And so what you're saying is there's a relationship between those two things.
There is. That's what.
Yep.
If people are attending your church just to get in your graveyard, they're not really thinking properly about what the graveyard's a picture of. There will be a resurrection.
Right.
Some will be resurrected to life, and some will be resurrected to eternal death.
So if someone's excommunicated but they want to be buried there, do they have to be cremated?
They can find someplace else to be buried. It's not their yard.
Cremation as the last step of church discipline. No.
And we just look at it and, I mean, we kind of laugh about it, but there was the idea that an unbeliever wasn't to be buried on holy ground, that there was holy ground that was the ground that was dedicated where, like Joshua was talking about before, about the example where they expected at the resurrection that There'd be a group of believers there. And it is that picture that the kings got buried in different places depending on their faithfulness.
But then the Catholics turn that into, well, if you're not buried, at least at some points, I'm not
Right.
saying now, but if you're not buried in the churchyard, then you go to hell.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, people twist every doctrine. But it doesn't mean that we ignore the doctrine because people can twist it.
And if you want to look more into these topics, I'll try to find a link. There's a conference I listened to a few years ago that was dealing with, dying and like some of the issues in terms of like what's the term? Euthanasia is the living will, that type of thing, and then burial. And I from a biblical perspective, and I thought it was pretty helpful. I'll try to find a link and put it in the description. If you hear this, that means I found the link. One quick question is, because I think there's people, we know someone who's even dealing with this right now. So a lot of people, their parents have said, "I want to be cremated." So say you're the only child, and your parents said they want to be cremated. How do you honor them?
Well, I think then what you do is you honor them by talking about them beforehand, talking about the issue beforehand, so that they think. I mean, even like my in-laws, first one was cremated, but we talked, and the second one was not, and so we should be persuading people.
There can also be a part of it where, you can honor someone even by not going with their wishes. There's times where that's the right thing to do as well, because when they're dead, the dead their body doesn't belong to them in death, in a sense. You know what I mean? And so there's this part of it where
kind of, but if it depends on
Right.
how their wishes were expressed and other things, you can
Sure.
be bound. And a lot of times, if it was in a will that says that this is what's going to happen,
Right.
they've expressed their will, and
Yep.
they do have control of their body even after death.
right. And there's other times where that's not. That's what I'm
Well,
saying.
they could have just expressed, "I want to be cremated," and you go, "Well, I'm sorry, when you're gone, I'm not going to give you that sign because you didn't do it in a way that's strong enough and is enforceable enough to cause me to go, no, this is what we're forced to do." It's easy for us to think of things like cremation and not understand how this actually changes culture and changes the church's culture and changes how people are thinking about life and death and eternal life. But these things are important, which is why God writes about them and gives us laws about them and talks about them. And too often we want to separate ourselves and say that we don't have to listen to what God says about these things. But it really damages us when we do that, when we don't say, well, what did God say about these things? Because they matter and they have real effects and they're really damaging our society. And so the church needs to start to think and be more deliberate to take every thought captive, even about things like cremation. Thanks for joining us.